if a coach needs to relay a message quite quickly, sometimes a player doesn't know the answers. So you being able to share your knowledge and then check their learning is a real important part of getting a message across quickly.
Can you explain what the different methods of communication are and provide insight into when and why you would use them? So in terms of different methods of communication, I'd probably be leaning more towards how do you effectively use commands. So when's the right time to instruct? When might be the right time to ask questions? In my context, obviously as a coach developer, there's two that we possibly may look to use more than others, and that would be the observation and feedback part, and also the Q&A, the question and answer.
I think what's really important to consider is that all those types of communication have a place, and I think there's definitely been an involvement over recent years in terms of making sure that we are involving the players more in terms of question and answering. And I think certainly when I was playing a long time ago, when I first started out, it was a case that coaching was very much command style. The coach told you what you needed to do and you did it. Whereas I think, the way that we communicate has definitely evolved, and like we said, that getting that player ownership and making sure that we understand what it is that the players want. You mentioned around the observation, and I think that's something that is really key, isn't it? Because I think sometimes as a coach we can try and see everything and miss everything, whereas just taking the time to maybe watch one player for a couple of minutes, maybe using the 6 capabilities as a framework to look and think, well, what is it that I'm actually seeing? Is there anything I can help them with in terms of the timing or the movement or the techniques? And that's a really powerful tool, isn't it, in terms of that communication?
I think you mentioned right at the start, Craig, about communication styles has its place, and there is a time for the command style still to be in there. If a coach needs to relay a message quite quickly, sometimes a player doesn't know the answers. So you being able to share your knowledge and then check their learning is a real important part of getting a message across quickly. Other ways of communicating as a coach is to demonstrate. So, if you've got a good skill set and you want to demonstrate something perfect, the players will see that good example. Or if you've got a player who's got outstanding technique, they can be your communication tool as well. And effectively using other players to communicate to each other is a really powerful tool, sharing their knowledge, sharing their learning, sharing what they've picked up in the session as well. Open questions are a great way to get a level of understanding of what the players do know, so that they're sharing their thoughts, sharing their information.
I think something I found really useful as well on that point you've made there, Joe, around the questioning is actually planning my questions ahead of the session as well. That becomes part of your planning process. And again, going back to another point we've touched on around knowing your players, you can then start to target questions which are appropriate for the players.
The point you made about targeting players, being quite specific to an individual. So again, the noticing, the observing, who is giving you the feedback, but who's not giving you the feedback. So then trying to draw information out of that particular player, whether it's a youngster, whether it's a senior player, is a real good tool again for you as a coach to know what they've taken on board or where they might still have gaps in their learning or understanding.
It's important to remember as well that question and answer doesn't have to be in front of the whole group, does it? We'll talk about interventions, but I think those just little one-to-one question and answer sessions while the game's going on, while the session's going on, can be really powerful in terms of a learning tool as well.
What I've seen to be really effective is, again, using other methods of communication. So whether it's a tactics board, something visual that the players can see. So lots of different ways of communicating and getting that feedback.
And I think you've both touched on the point about it. It seems to come down to knowing your players, doesn't it? And what they need. So like you say, in terms of where are visuals appropriate, who are you targeting with the questions, it all comes down to, knowing your players.
What impact can a change in manner, tone and volume have when you're speaking to players? Absolutely huge impact in terms of the tone, manner and the way you communicate. Getting a sense of where the group is from an energy point of view. Your tone of voice can either bring that energy down or can lift that energy.
I think what's key as well is having that variety within the session, isn't it? Because I think I was certainly guilty when I started coaching of trying to be really high tempo, really energetic for the full session, and after 20 minutes I was shattered and then it dropped. And I think, especially particularly on match day as well, that can just become noise to the players, can't it? The point you made though, Joe, is a brilliant one in terms of, you know, when you need to raise the tempo, when you need to raise what's happening on the pitch, then you've got the power to do that through the tone of your voice, haven't you?
The energy that you portray sort of like sets the tone for how you want things. Sometimes you don't always want it to be frantic and chaotic. So actually keeping in one sort of tone, whether it's energetic and high and passionate, and it might be you and your character, but sometimes that might not always be what the players need, and sometimes they might need a little bit of calm. And also we've got to consider what the players have been going through during the day, whether it's at school, whether it's at college, even if it's at work, if you're working with senior players. And sometimes we need to meet the players where they're at.
Going back to that, you know, question and answer we talked about, that those first questions at the start of the session when they first arrive, you can determine, well, what type of day have they had? You know, what do they need today from me in terms of that support, in terms of raising the energy, in terms of keeping them a little bit calmer maybe, and that's really important, isn't it, in terms of linking those together?
It is. And being able to draw a group in by raising your voice, you know, the group might sort of back off, but just lowering that tone, and you'll notice people coming forward and starting to listen a bit more.
Absolutely.
So next question is, can body language affect how coaches communicate with their players? I think the statistic is something about 55% of communication comes from body language. And I think, you know, particularly, again, going back to match day, and that demeanour on the sideline of a coach can play a big part in terms of what happens on the pitch.
Body language is like, it's picked up first by the players, that's what they see. And if you're not giving out the right messages, they'll pick up on that straight away.
I think seeking maybe feedback as well from other people, because they might see things that you're not realising.
It might be actually assigning parents to sort of give you a little bit of feedback, or prepping them beforehand. This is what I'm looking at. I want to get the best for the players. Would you mind being able to sort of observe me and observe how my body language sort of impacts the players that we're working with?
You know, one thing I'll do when I go into club is film the coach on match day and observe his behaviours, have him mic'd up, listen to the things that he's saying, that he wants the players to hear, but then perhaps he doesn't want the players to hear. And then we get a chance to review that. And it really is enlightening, I think, when you see yourself on camera and listen back to certain moments of the game, and get a sense again of what you were feeling at that point and why did you say that thing.
I still remember the first time when I got mic'd up and you know, was observed during a session, and when you look at back and you start to notice your mannerisms, there's things that you probably you aren't always aware of. So I noticed that I talk with my hands a lot, and I'm noticing it sitting here in this, that I talk with my hands a lot. So it's actually, it starts to shine a little bit of a light on things that you're not always aware of. So what any message I'd give to any coach that's probably going to be watching this would be open to the idea of being filmed or receiving feedback, and not take it as a negative if there's something that you don't necessarily like hearing, or something might surprise you, but actually having that self-awareness either gives you the opportunity to either change it or actually be comfortable with it, and how do you develop it further.
I think some of the most powerful feedback can come from players as well. And you know, I've got players that I work with who I know I can go to and ask, you know, what was that session like? How did I come across that session, or whatever the question might be around body language in this case, and I know they'll give me an honest answer. The
more aware, the more self-aware you become about your body language, the more you can actually use it as a tool to relay a message, whether that be, come on, we need to drive things forward, or we're just going to ease back a little bit. But that self-awareness becomes really key, I think, with the communication to players.
What is the most important thing for a coach to remember when they're trying to communicate clearly and confidently? I think from my perspective, I'd probably say the most important thing for a coach to remember would be to try to be authentic where you can, and be comfortable in experimenting with the different types of communication. So it might be using a tactics board, and actually that group might not necessarily warm to a tactics board, and they might be more kinesthetic learners that like to do as opposed to be shown visually. I think it's about being authentic and being able to adapt where you can.
Going back to one of the points we made right at the start about being clear, concise and having conviction, to give no more than sort of 3 key points if it's a team talk at half time or before the game, and just those 3 key messages, because it's been proven players aren't going to take on any more than that.
That's really important in terms of, if you are making an intervention, you know what that intervention is, you know what the message is, and not starting something not really knowing where it's going, because that's when it can start to go off in different directions, and you know, that's when it becomes confusing to the players.
And also, as well as that, it's having an understanding of who's listening to the message you're giving. So do all players need to hear the message that you're conveying with communication? So it might be, as opposed to, the days of like massive team talks, and yeah, they still happen. There's a place for that because we're playing a team game and there's a team strategy possibly at play. But actually, does everyone need to hear every bit of information? And can we be really clever in how we speak to certain players relevant to what they need to hear at a time?
So we talked about team talks there, but in coaching sessions itself, your positioning is really key, and being able to drift into the practice and have a quiet word with one individual. You can't be in there forever. So that clarity is really important.
And I think that can be one of the most demotivating things for a player, isn't it? If a coach says, right, stop, stand still, I'm the number 9, and then the coach goes and speaks to the right back for 2 minutes and I can't hear what they're saying, anything, and you can see body language drops like that. And I think, again, it's clear, concise, who needs this message? Is it everybody? Is it one player? And going in and doing it.
And coming back to your point that you made earlier, do we plan for this? So as a coach listening to this, are we planning for communication and how we're going to get our messages across within the session as well? Not just the session design, but how we're going to deliver that, who we're going to target.
So again, having that strategy where you're going to be consistent in your message, you're clear about what you're doing, and the language that you use is the same language, and checking that the players actually understand that language. So getting that consolidation after every sort of session to make sure that they've taken on board the key points. How important is it for coaches to be great listeners? Does that affect their ability to communicate effectively? Listening is part of communication, and it's really important that you have that as a key skill, whether that's in a one-to-one, whether it's with the group, whether it's observing the session or the game itself, and being able to pick up on those messages that come from the players and deal with those appropriately. Really important.
It links into, you'll go in with your session plan, but you don't have to stick to that rigidly depending on what actually happens in front of you. Listening in terms of observing what's actually happening. Well, actually, they haven't quite got that yet, so we'll continue. Or actually, we can move on a bit quicker than I thought, and having that adaptability and flexibility to be able to listen and observe to what's in front of you to make the changes to the session as you need to, isn't it?
If we're asking them questions, it's not just to get a right answer. It's sometimes just to get their perspective, and that's a real part of listening, because then we can start to plan after that of, well, how do we support that player with the gaps in their knowledge?
And picking up on the listening skills, sometimes to repeat what the individual said, just to be clear that they've heard the information back, but also the types of words that they use. I'm feeling this, might show emotion. Picking up on those messages as well allows you then to get a real insight into the player. And as we've all sort of spoke about today, knowing your players makes this a lot easier than players that you don't know.
And the most powerful listening, alluding to that, happens at the start of the session, doesn't it? Right, what kind of frame of mind are the players in, and that can really drive the session, can't it, going forward in terms of understanding where they're at that current moment in time.
When players come to us, they're coming to us as coaches, so making them feel comfortable in our environment, getting their thought processes away from what may have happened at school or in the car with the mum and dad into the coaching, so we can get the best out of them within that environment. That's our responsibility. Focus on the football.
By listening, it's a real great opportunity to build a connection with players as well. So in terms of just asking them, just a simple thing about like, how was your day, can really build real good rapport with your players. Not only do you get an understanding, but you're far more likely to get a buy-in, because a player will know that you really care about them. It's not just about the football, it's about them as a person. So listening, I would say, would be a very important part of this.
I think on that as well, Craig, it's particularly, if you're working with groups in the foundation phase, play phase, that, listening to what are some of the things that are really engaging them outside of football. It might be their favourite cartoon, it might be, whatever's on the packed lunchbox, their favourite computer game, and using that to frame the session as well, and develop some themes around that, which can be really engaging at the start of their football journey as well.
And you also hear players talking about games that they've watched, what was on the TV the night before. Did they watch the Man City game? You see the ones that have got a real love for the game, and being able to bring that into the dynamic of conversations or the actual coaching session itself gives them that real feeling that they could be a Haaland or a De Bruyne or a John Stones.
So next question is, in your opinion, what does effective communication look like at the training ground compared to match day is or isn't there a difference? For me, straight away, something you mentioned earlier, Craig, was about being your authentic self. And I think for me, that doesn't change whether you're at the training ground or whether it's a match day. And some of the key things that we want to communicate to our players is being supportive, being helpful, providing them with information which is going to help them to get better. And for me, that doesn't change whether it's the training day or the match day.
I also feel that communication isn't just assigned to those 2 days, so it's about how you're communicating in between. So if you know that there's a player that's not necessarily going to be starting, are you giving them enough time to correct their emotions, or to channel their emotions and be present on the game day? So by leaving it late or leaving it on the game day, how would that affect their performance?
We can't take away from the fact that match day is different to a training day, but as long as we've got certain standards, that people are bought into, the staff are bought into, then we can get that consistency of message. But again, it's that self-awareness. So if it is a big game that we're playing at the stadium, and there's press there, there's supporters there, there's parents there, yeah, it's going to have a different impact. People are going to feel perhaps a little bit nervous, a little bit more stress, and that could be staff as well. How do we manage that? Because it is something different that we don't deal with on a daily basis. And then we might have a strategy to deal with something as and when it arrives.
And that consistency of message is key, from the programme right down to grassroots, isn't it? Development football in terms of, ultimately the match day is just another episode of their learning experience, isn't it? Particularly in development football, and it's making sure that there are those links between training and match day, like you've said, and it's not a case of the two completely separate things, and make sure we've got those overarching themes. And these, one way we're going to help you to develop is through training, another way we're going to help you to develop is through the match day, but that consistency is the key to that, isn't it?
Yeah. What advice do you have to help coaches improve their communication when working with different age groups? In terms of advice, I would lean more towards, do they understand the group, and do they understand the context in which they're there? So are they there for social purposes, or are they there to develop as players towards something different? If I was to give a piece of advice, I think it would be to have a real understanding of who your players are and how they learn, and to be curious about asking questions and getting to know the people that you're working with.
I think it's definitely considering the age and stage that the players are at. If you've got a group of 5 or 6 year olds, then you're probably not going to be talking about a low block and a high press, but you'll still be working on some of the key concepts around that, around some basic attacking and defending skills. But the communication or the way you get that across might be through a tag game, a game of Bulldog, for example, as opposed to a 7v7 or a 9v9 game. So I think being really clear about who it is that you're speaking to.
And as well as knowing your players, knowing why they're there, you need to know why you're there as well. And again, different tools you may have with different age groups. So if you've got a group of 6, 7, 8 year olds and you're communicating with them, you actually want to be at their level. If it's more senior players, then, and certainly in the pro game, you know that it's their career, and therefore your knowledge and understanding of the latest techniques, strategies, tactics, having that knowledge of the subject is what they're looking for from you.
I think probably another area of the game to consider is disability and para football, and that communication is really key as well, because a lot of grassroots clubs might have a player with disability, such as a visual impairment. So we've mentioned tactics boards, so having bigger markers, the colours that you might use, brighter colours for them, are going to be really helpful in terms of the communication to them. Any team that you come across, whether it's a grassroots team right up to the professional game, all the players are going to have different needs, aren't they? And they're all going to have need different ways that you communicate with them to get the best out of them as a player.
In any game, we're going to come across people who've got disabilities, and we have to have an understanding of that as a coach as to how we can effectively communicate.
And I found it quite useful as well, working with players. Some players, you talk about in terms of neurological conditions and things like having structure boards on my tactics board. So this is what we're going to start with. This is how we're going to go into this. Then we'll have a break, and then we'll do this. And again, that consistency in terms of how you set your session up. So you might have an area which is you know, that's where you go as a little timeout area if you need it, or a little safe space. This is where we put our drinks, and that consistency, again, a message. Doesn't always have to be a football message, but just that consistency as a coach, which gives a really supportive environment for the players.
Again, not every player's the same, not every person's the same, so it's how we're trying to cater to the needs of as many people as possible.
Yeah.
If we were to sum this up summarise this in one statement or one piece of advice, what would be the main one for you guys?
I would go straight away with dealing with individual needs. So every player is different. Everybody has their own particular needs that you as a coach need to be aware of.
Being absolutely clear in terms of what the players want and helping them to do that. And, you know, I think that 12 to 16 age is quite a critical one as well, in terms of that's when they're probably during those years they're going to establish, right, well, am I going to try and push on in the game? Am I going to try and make it to the highest level, or am I going to start to play it socially? Again, it goes back to understanding your players, knowing your players, and that helps you to communicate as effectively as possible.
Is there an age group that is typically more challenging than others to communicate with? What's the best way to navigate that? I think that depends on the experience of the coach. So, you know, my experience, if you like, is working with professional players at academy and at senior level. And I find real difficulty communicating with the youngsters, the 7, 8, 9-year-olds. When I say communicating, it's a different skill set that's required working in those age groups. So I think knowing what your own particular skill set is, where you're comfortable working, but then being aware of your gaps, or my gaps in terms of coaching and communication, and working hard to sort of to fill those gaps.
I think that's absolutely key in terms of that, you know, that experience and expertise. And expertise doesn't necessarily mean in terms of football knowledge to have a group of senior professionals in front of you, but expertise to, you know, I've seen coaches who've had 25-year-olds in the palm of the hand for an hour and a half because just the way the expertise they've had to be able to be able to deal with that situation. You know, you might be able to give a fantastic half-time team talk to a group of elite players, but there's other people who can, you know, talk to these 5, 6-year-olds expertly, and how can you learn from them, and vice versa as well.
And just like you've spoken about, it's about trying to get an understanding of different people's experiences, and really, we spoke about observation earlier. Do we spend enough time observing other practitioners and other coaches in their environments?
I think as well, it's, again, particularly working with those younger age groups, that coaches, there might be coaches out there who probably don't see themselves as coaches, but have got expertise, you know, in terms of being able to provide a really positive environment for the younger age groups, because they might, you know, be a reception or a year 1 teacher at school, and they might not know a lot about football, but they can provide a really positive environment for that group.
And what I find with academy coaches and academy football is that there are full-time members of staff and part-time members of staff, but all who come from different backgrounds. And what we're finding more of is we're getting people coming in from different sports. We're also getting people coming in with different expertise, whether that's sports science, medicine, psychology. So our job as coaches is to get a real insight into all of the 4 corners of player development, and how we can tie that technical, tactical element into the psych, the social and the physical part of development. Gives us a better chance of being able to communicate more effectively in all of those areas, but communicate with conviction and confidence.
What are your quick fire top tips to help coaches communicate effectively? I'll start us off with, I think something we've mentioned a lot today, in terms of having a real clear, concise message that you want to get across, whether that's over the short term, medium term, long term, whether it's a 20-second intervention, but just having clear, concise messages, philosophies that you want to get across, which can then translate to the players at whatever age and stage they're at in terms of their career.
My quick message would be curious. Be curious about the people that you're working with. Be curious about your own practices and how you might be able to develop. So yeah, go in with curiosity. 2 points from me. One would be about continue to develop your own learning and your own knowledge in all aspects of player development, but listen carefully.